Okay, so today I will be talking about the impact that an increased minimum wage nationally will have on the U.S. economy. In 2016, Starbucks increased the wages for its lowest earning employees to more than double that of the minimum wage, which at the time was $7.25 an hour. Advocates for an increased minimum wage cite this as an example of what to follow and say that this will help improve the economy and raise people out of poverty. Empirical data on the subject, however, reveals that an increase to the national minimum wage will actually have a harmful impact on the economy. It will do this in 3 different ways. Firstly, an increase to the minimum wage would cause everyday consumer items to increase in price. Secondly, it would harm small business owners that are operating at the margin of, with minimal profit margins. And thirdly, it will result in a decline in employment opportunities. So exploring this, my first claim, when employers are forced to pay their employees more, they will seek ways to compensate for the earning loss, and the easiest way of doing that is to increase the cost of their prices. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is a federally funded organization that looks at labor trends within the U.S. And in 2015, they found that just a 10% increase in wages nationally would result in almost a 25% increase in the products of that company. What this means is that everyday products like gas, groceries, Starbucks, coffee, everything will go up, and this will be less money in the pockets of everyday consumers and less money driving the economy. My second point is that this leads into my second point, which is that small businesses can't afford to pay their employees more. The majority of small businesses already pay as much money as they can, and while it's easy for companies like Starbucks and McDonald's to pay their companies more, the majority of small businesses are operating on the border of success and failure. And what this means is that an increase to the national minimum wage will have devastating effects to those small businesses. The National Small Business Association represents small businesses nationally and looks at trends within small businesses. And in 2014, they found that just a 5% increase in the national minimum wage will result in a 3% loss of all small businesses within the country. Now, 3% sounds like a small amount, but 3% of all businesses is literally thousands and thousands of businesses. And these are businesses that will no longer contribute to the economy and will no longer employ people who desperately need that money. And this leads into my third and final point, which is that an increase in the national minimum wage will result in a decline in overall employment opportunities. And this will occur in 2 ways. Firstly, either the people that are employed will see their hours cut, and if you look at the National Bureau of Economic Research is again a federally funded organization that looks at economic trends, and they found in a study that if the minimum wage was increased to $10.10 an hour, this would lead to between $100 and $150 less annually for employees. And the reason for this is that while they are making more money hourly, the number of hours they're getting is being cut, and the number of employees that are being hired is also being cut. The second reason that employment opportunities would go down is that companies will actually cut the employment altogether. They'll cut the position altogether. And we're seeing this today, especially in companies like Walmart, Starbucks, not so much Starbucks, but McDonald's, with the automation of basic skilled jobs. PreWeb is a privately funded research organization, and they surveyed over 1,600 employers and found that of that 1,600, 38% of those companies said that they would, if the minimum wage was increased, they would have to cut jobs altogether. 54% said that they would have to stop hiring people, and 65% said that they would have to increase the cost of their products. In conclusion, while it may seem virtuous to pay people more, it's important to look at the effects that this increase in the minimum wage would have. The cost of automating jobs, if increasing the minimum wage would encourage automation of jobs and would also encourage employers to lay off the majority of their employees, which would greatly harm the economy and also businesses. The harm of increasing prices, the harm to small businesses, and the harm to wages for low-wage, low-skilled employees is far greater than the benefits to increasing those wages. Thank you.
All right, well, the identification of the subject at the beginning is okay. We know generally the subject is going to be the minimum wage. The direction that you're going, I think, is interesting because it runs contrary to the Starbucks example that you use as your attention device. And you explain that pretty clearly. I do think, excuse me, I do think you could be a little bit more explicit about the proposition, but I heard it and it was clear. And there is an excellent preview of what the supporting structure is going to be. So at the beginning of the speech, everything is generally going well. There could be some minor improvements, but you're on the right track there. The body of the speech is also clearly organized and signposted as you're going through it, so there's no problem there. I do think that there's some question about the sufficiency of proof on a couple of points. Your first point, for instance, you've got one piece of statistical information concerning prices, and that's about as far as it goes. Now, you do suggest that it comes from a very credible source, which I appreciate. But it is a singular piece of information that leads you to that conclusion. And believe me, after hearing speeches last night, I had one guy who gave a speech kind of going the opposite direction of yours, and his was so full of studies and research and examples and all this kind of stuff that it was a little overwhelming what you're trying to hear from his argument. So I know there's data out there, there's a lot of data out there, and I'm not saying that we need a data dump, but I think you need to have a little bit something more substantive that's going to be convincing there, especially on that first point. I think you were a little bit better on the other points, providing some information and offering a couple of ways to prove that. Your explanation, and this would be an example of how this is a little bit different from the speech that I heard last night. You at least explained all of these processes and then provided some information on it. He basically made the claim and presented information without explaining what it was. It's like, well, the data proves that I don't have to explain how this accomplishes those things. And I thought that you did a pretty good job trying to explain those things. But, like I said, there's not a diversity of information here. You've got the statistical data from the small business group, from the national group that looks at business investment, and from the BLS. But, that statistical data is, that's pretty solid, but there's not a lot of testimony. For example, you mentioned small businesses who are operating on the margins. A quote or two from people who own those kinds of businesses talking about how they're struggling to make it would be a good way of illustrating what it is you're talking about. And I think that that would add some content here that would make it a little bit more compelling also. But the structure is easy to follow. You label things clearly. Like I said, you have generally good evidence on things. And I think it's also actually delivered very effectively, too. You're looking at us the whole time. You're speaking to us in a normal voice. You are trying to give your explanations as you go along. And you come across as a person, not somebody who's reading a bunch of stuff, but as somebody who understands what the argument is that they're presenting. And I think that that benefits your presentation a lot. All right. Thank you.